Things, isn't that true? Amen. Thank you, Gail, for the introduction. I was listening, I was like, oh, this speaker sounds really great. I can't wait for them. But thank you for that introduction. I want to thank Gail as well as all the others on the MLK committee for inviting me to be here. It is an honor to be the 2022 MLK commemoration speaker. And I want to just thank all those who put in the work to organize this event and to make it happen. And I didn't realize what a blessing it would be to hear about all the good work that's being done and just the commitment to justice from our young folks, and excited about what God is going to be doing in your lives and the impact that you will have in our community or wherever you find yourself. And so that's exciting to be witnesses of what God is doing among these young people's lives. You know, at a time when Dr. King often gets propped up and domesticated and watered down, I believe that it's really important to find times to learn from him beyond just, you know, having him frozen in time, frozen in 1963, giving only one speech. In fact, not even a whole speech, just like one phrase of a speech, and never much more than that. It seems that it's really important to go beyond that. There's a great urgency of our moment that requires that we deepen our commitment to truth-telling, to compassion, to an unwavering focus on deepening justice, and attentiveness to the liberating and healing presence of God at work in our world. Dr. King modeled that kind of life in his public witness, and so today, it is my pleasure to speak to you and invite us to join the struggle for freedom and peace. As Vincent Harding, a friend of Dr. King and someone that I got to know a little bit, with a great legacy of his own, reminded us that there's a river that has been flowing through the ages. It is full of people who have tapped into the human spirit of resistance against the death-dealing forces of our world. In memory of Dr. King, now is the time for us to affirm the dignity and worth of every person. Now is the time to stand up and speak up against injustice near and far. Now is the time to hold tight to love in our struggle against hatred, apathy, and greed. So today I would like to place some of the contemporary challenges that we face in conversation with what Dr. King referred to as the triple evils, right? The triple evils of racism, materialism, and militarism. And I've entitled my talk, A Revolution of Values, in honor of Dr. King's striking use of that very phrase. Over the past couple of years, many people in our nation have once again been confronted with the way that systems of policing in the United States often steal, kill, and destroy. In the summer of 2020, some Americans began awakening to the racist systems and patterns that exist in our country as they witnessed the racial violence and the response of uprisings and activism. For a few, this moment pulled the curtains back on the anti-Black cycles of death that have plagued our society for centuries. The challenges of the pandemic over the last couple of years have also revealed a lot about our nation's distorted values. The global crisis required everyone to pull together. It was a moment when our interconnectedness seemed to be so obvious to some of us because what we do as individuals affect others and not just ourselves. And yet we have been unable to work together communally, and some have even refused to consider the well-being of their neighbors. Despite having enormous economic resources as a nation, our government stumbled, conspiracies thrived, faith leaders hesitated, and too many people avoided prioritizing the needs of those who are most vulnerable. Our response revealed a moral bankruptcy and a hard-heartedness deep in the soul of the nation. In moments like these, it is especially hard to see the faces of those who are disproportionately suffering. There have been so many deaths, so many that have been neglected, and like always in this nation, I mean, just think about it. There are 500,000 people without homes in the United States. The problem isn't a lack of resources, but a lack of regard for the well-being of our neighbors. The animosity towards redistributing the abundance of resources our nation has for the well-being of all always seems especially striking when considering our unwavering commitment to funding the war machine and military-industrial complex. Our nation has budgeted close to $800 billion so we can dominate the globe to our advantage. This lavish spending requires very little discussion or convincing compared to eradicating poverty and homelessness. When it comes to war, unexamined conformist thought wins the day as we concentrate resources for power, control, and death-dealing weapons over life-giving initiatives that enhance the quality of life for all. These were the issues that consumed Dr. King in his later years, especially how they were interrelated with one another. He understood that racism, materialism, and militarism were bound up together and degrading our efforts towards mutual thriving. And today, if we are going to take on the triple evils of racism, materialism, and militarism, we will need to undergo a radical revolution of values and practice. The first of Dr. King's triple evils was racism. We have in our society very different ways that people think about racism. You know that I often say that there's a thin definition and a thick definition of racism in terms of how we talk about what racism is, right? The thin definition is to think about racism purely as like personal prejudice or hatred between one person towards another person, right? And it's about like matters of the heart and if you hate black people or not, right? That's one way of talking about racism, and I think it's a pretty common way that a lot of people think about racism. But then there's what I call a thick description of racism. And a thick description of racism isn't merely just looking at the heart, but it's looking at how we literally organize our society, how we structure our society. It's looking at policies and practices and systems and institutions and you know, all the different ways that we structure our society that advantages some and disadvantages others. It's paying attention to the amount of money and resources, right, that go into our different schools and who has access to health care and livable wages and jobs and quality housing. It's looking at the very way that we structure and organize our society. And so there's this thin definition that usually often doesn't help us understand what's going on. It's just more focused on the human heart. And then there's this thick description that actually begins to unveil the patterns and practices of our society. And of course, when we think about racism, we also have to understand that it is a hierarchically structured reality, right? That is to say that from the very beginnings as colonial conquest began and as modernity was being birthed, it began to imagine that there were different kinds of human beings, and that those who were European or of European descent were somehow both whiteness and body, culture, and norms were somehow more superior than everyone else's, right? And so there's a hierarchical way of understanding and seeing, right, that racism is just as much about how we see one another and how we're seen in the world as it is anything else. And it's about power, right? Those who have access. We can look at clearly who the majority of those who've been president or CEOs or those in different seats of decision making, whether it be locally, regionally, statewide, nationally, globally. There's a disproportionate white power that exists within our society, and we have to pay attention to those who control the decisions for everybody else. One of the ways I began to describe this, I talk about this in my first book, Trouble I've Seen. I had an experience where when I was still an MDiv student, I had a pastor who was also an MDiv student at the same seminary reach out to me, and he asked me if I could meet up with him sometime so we could get to know each other a little bit more. And so he invited me out, and we went. It was a hot summer day, and we met at a McDonald's. And we met at this McDonald's, and we weren't really looking to eat. It was the middle of the afternoon, and so we just got sweet teas. You ever had the sweet teas from McDonald's? You know, the really sugary, it's like so sugary, right? I won't lie, I must confess, I always joke that I love sweet tea so much, right? Especially when I'm down south and get like the real sweet tea, right? Not like not the sweetened tea, the sweet tea where like you put the straw in and it's so much sugar, the straw doesn't even move, right? And you start drinking it, and like you start getting like your dentist knows you've done something terribly wrong because he thinks that cavity's coming up. He's like waking up in the middle of the night sweating, like that real sweet tea that's so good. Yes. So that's what we were doing. We're drinking sweet tea together. We're just kind of getting to know each other, and basically we were just telling stories and asking each other questions and realizing ways that some of us, like some of our experiences were actually had a lot of shared experiences that we would have never thought, but also some different ways of growing up and raising. So we're just kind of just getting to know each other, right? Nothing special. And as we're talking and sharing, partway through, my friend here, he's this pastor in the suburbs of Philly at this kind of large, kind of growing, fast-growing 20s and 30s at that time, your old church, right? He grabs one of the sweet tea cups and he puts it in between us and he says, "Drew, you see this cup? You see," he says, "there's a logo on one side and writing on the other, but I can't see what's on your side of the cup and you can't see what's on my side of the cup. And so I need your eyes to see what's on your side of the cup, and you need my eyes to see what's on my side of the cup." And so I'm thinking like, oh, like we're having a little moment here, right? We're having a little moment, a little after school special, a little full house moment, I don't know, right? And it was a really sweet gesture. And so I let him finish, but then I said to him, and this probably sounded really cocky, but I was like, "I already know what's on your side of the cup." And then I explained what I meant. I said, "Look, since very early on when I was growing up, like even in majority black neighborhoods, I had majority white teachers. Eurocentric history, literature, art. Went off to college, mostly white professors. In fact, down the road, Messiah, I was a first-year student. I was the only African-American on my floor the first year. I had to figure out how to navigate culturally that space. MDiv, PhD, even in places that thought they were doing better, still disproportionately white, right? Even the work that I do, I'm constantly, as I speak and travel before white audiences, and I have to kind of have a sense as I enter into white dominant cultural spaces, how people are perceiving my body. What are they interpreting out of my body? I've always had to enter into different white dominant cultural spaces, navigate, understand, discern what's happening all around me. And what I said to him is, the reality is that this is not reciprocal. You can go your whole life, I explained, and said, you don't even have to step foot in a black community, none less understand black history and intellectual thought and arts, musical trends and such, right? You don't have to understand our concerns and conversations and debates that are going on. In fact, he was at that time, I believe, an IVP author, right? And yet he could go his whole life and that would not impact the kind of work that he was doing to that day. So what I wanted for him to understand is that as nice as it was for us to have this moment of sharing tea together, that our conversation, our cultural exchange moment was not going to be bringing down the walls of justice. It was going to take more than just a conversation for justice and equity to live and to thrive and flourish in our society. Because there were institutions and policies and practices that made life different for folks from my community than for his community. And so we've got to begin to have this thicker vision for what justice requires of us. Yes, we do need to have those conversations. Yes, we do need to get to know one another, but we're going to have to do a lot more than that. We're going to have to actually struggle to actually transform the diseased way that we've organized our society that harms some and advantages others. One of the biggest concerns in the past decade of how anti-black racism manifests itself in our society that has been focused on has been in regards to police brutality. Police brutality is a widespread and intergenerational form of injustice in this nation. It's nothing new. It has been a problem plaguing our country for a very long time. Dr. King spoke about it often in his own speeches. He would mention, as he moved, just mention police brutality. Dr. King, the federal government documented the systemic nature of this problem in the aftermath of the Ferguson uprisings in response particularly to Michael Brown's killing. On one hand, they said that there wasn't enough evidence to convict Brown's killer, but on the other hand, the federal investigation unveiled a deeply racist system of abuse that disproportionately impacted black residents in Ferguson. This is what the report stated. This is a quote. Ferguson's law enforcement practices are shaped by the city's focus on revenue rather than by public safety needs. The emphasis on revenue has compromised the institutional character of Ferguson's police department, contributing to a pattern of unconstitutional policing, and has also shaped its municipal court, leading to procedures that raise due process concerns and inflict unnecessary harm on members of the Ferguson community. Further, Ferguson's police and municipal court practices both reflect and exacerbate existing racial bias, including racial stereotypes. Ferguson's own data establish clear racial disparities that adversely impact African Americans. The evidence shows that discriminatory intent is part of the reason for these disparities, unquote. Police discrimination as one dimension of a centuries-long history of oppression of racial minorities has been humiliating, degrading, and at times death-dealing in the United States. In the United States, black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than their white counterparts, and 98.3% of all police killings have occurred without any charges brought. This is why there was so much shock recently, right, and surprise by many people after Ahmaud Arbery's killers were found guilty. It is true that this wasn't really about policing in that particular case, but nonetheless, these types of assaults against black people are left often without any accountability. In this case, the original district attorney initially tried to clear the 3 men who hunted down and killed Ahmaud Arbery of all charges. It actually took unprecedented amounts of massive protests around the world for accountability for his death to be implemented. Derek Chauvin was also indicted for killing George Floyd. Unfortunately, in the 3rd case that was being watched closely, no one was found guilty of killing Breonna Taylor. And yet somehow, the grand jury believed that the officers were responsible for endangering the lives of other tenants in other apartments, but not Breonna Taylor. The massive global response and Black Lives Matter protests helped more Americans begin to see that police brutality and violence are intimately embedded into our society and that it requires massive efforts to counterbalance the anti-Black biases in our institutions and our society. So when Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd's murders sparked outrage, reinvigorating the Black Lives Matter movement, it wasn't just about those individuals. It was about the small, large, and death-dealing interactions with police that happen every day in poor black and brown neighborhoods. I've personally witnessed my own neighbors being wrongly assaulted by police when I lived in Philly. I have family members who have been falsely arrested for fitting the description. And I have had a gun pointed to my own head during a routine traffic stop because the officers couldn't see my humanity and gazed at me through an anti-Black lens. If we put it in a global perspective, our police in the United States kill more people in 24 days than many nations kill in 24 years. Police often are used for social control of people of color in this nation, as well as poor people, and to suppress social movements for change. This has become the norm for how many vulnerable neighborhoods experience policing systems. Nevertheless, we continue to pour and invest more and more economic resources into the very same policing systems, expecting different results. While some cities are talking about redirecting police resources towards social programs like education, housing, mental health, drug rehabilitation, and other strategies for social well-being, other communities are increasing their already bloated policing budgets. Our nation spends $100 billion on policing every year and another $80 billion on incarceration. Many cities that have massive wealth disparities and significant poverty, along with high amounts of homelessness, drug addiction, criminalized people with mental health challenges, and underfunded schools, spend between 25 and 40% of their city budget on policing. Many people have dismissed the defund police campaigns outright, but the enormous amounts of money being spent on policing and incarceration that has not created flourishing and safe neighborhoods for most vulnerable members of our society should compel us to reimagine both our city budgets and the kind of training and skills needed for those who will be intervening on the front lines while people are in crisis. When it comes to American racism, we need a revolution of values and practice. Before our society will ever make the needed policy changes, we will need to be able to recognize that everyone is made in the image of God and therefore have inherent dignity and worth. We have to receive the stories of those who have suffered under police brutality and discrimination and hold their sacred experiences and stories close and allow them to transform us. We need to empathetically enter in. We will need to find the courage to break from groupthink, to break from our assumptions about what policing really is in our nation, and we will have to confront, challenge, and transform the systems and policies that have perpetuated so much violence. But more broadly, if we're going to tackle racism as it manifests in a variety of dimensions in our society, it will require telling a more truthful story about our nation's history. We will have to speak truthfully about how this land was stolen from indigenous people and how the labor of black people was stolen and exploited, which directly sparked the economic machine of the nation and created the global economic reality we know now. If we let anti-CRT movements shut down every attempt to learn about our racist history and contemporary challenges, we will be unable to heal, grow, and envision a more just future. We all will have to do self-examination work around the ways that we see others and are seen in the world. How we live and perform race in everyday lives that are complicit in the systems that advantage and disadvantage our neighbors and that call us to live into myths and ideologies that are untrue. We will have to choose to resist complicity, or one day the history books will expose that our silence was betrayal. Dr. King didn't address racism in isolation, though. He understood that materialism was a distorted and morally bankrupt value system that guided American life, and materialism is the second of his triple evils. Our ability to change as a society hinges on our ability to get free from American materialism. Dr. King said, quote, "We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered," unquote. And Dr. King is right. Our values are deeply distorted. Our society cares more about the destruction of buildings than it does the destruction of people. Our society cares more about is in an idolatrous obsession with material things and profits and an apathetic disregard in response to the disproportionate sufferings of our fellow human beings. Many Americans are proud of our legacy of encouraging market competition, yet think little about our failure to instill a spirit of cooperation. This turns us against one another as though life were a zero-sum game rather than envisioning a world where we can all flourish and thrive together. Our society has lost sight of the dignity of all labor, that all work must get done has value, and that the people that labor for us ought to be treated with dignity and respect. Instead, workers' wages continue to be suppressed. Corporations often give more attention and concern to stockholders than they do to their own employees. This priority of profits over people is a dangerously diseased value system that is too often taken for granted in our society. The system of haves and have-nots is baked into the very structure of our society. It is encouraged by a really hyper-individualism and by the myth of meritocracy that somehow claims that hardworking people get what they deserve, which is wealth, and lazy people get poverty. This myth of meritocracy doesn't hold up with a careful view of who has wealth and who does not. Certainly, Paris Hilton isn't wealthy because of hard work. She's wealthy because she was born into generational wealth. And some people grew massive wealth but could not have done so without the many workers that they only pay minimum wage to. The more obvious explanation for our inequitable distribution of wealth can be tied to things like our ongoing suppression of fair and livable wages, our unquenchable greed, and of course, a centuries-long history of exploitation. So when I was in college, every summer I worked in a different warehouse. That's how I tried to make money to pay for school and help. And so every summer I found myself in a different warehouse. And one summer I actually worked in a Walmart warehouse, right? That's where I found myself working, was a Walmart warehouse one summer. And it was a bunch of young people, because it was kind of like a seasonal. They were kind of moving around to kind of like fix up and renovate different Walmarts. And so it was a kind of seasonal job. And so it was a lot of like college age folks who were working there. Were there for a summer. It was kind of a little fun, and then everybody went their different ways afterwards. And I didn't think much about it afterwards, went on with my life, got graduated, moved into Harrisburg, was pastoring, got married and moved back to Philly, began MDiv program. I was pastoring there in Philly. And then all of a sudden, like out of nowhere, a check comes in the mail. I don't remember exactly, I think it was like $300 or something, but basically Walmart was apparently like in a class action suit because of wage theft, right? They had been stealing little bits over time of wages from their workers. I wouldn't have even known. I had no clue that my wages were being robbed, right, from this wealthy, huge corporation. But it happens all the time in our nation. Wage theft is happening all the time, and especially to those who are undocumented. Our undocumented neighbors are particularly vulnerable to wage theft in our nation. Millions of dollars are stolen from workers every year. But when you think about wage theft, even worse than that is wage suppression. Much worse than wage theft. Wage suppression intentionally denies the dignity and value of all people who labor by intentionally halting and underpaying them for their work. In Pennsylvania, the minimum wage has barely risen since I was a teenager. While most states are trying to get their minimum wage to $15, which most estimate should have been done a long time ago, and therefore are pushing beyond that, Pennsylvania is still stuck at $7.25 an hour. It's wrong to pay people half-wage salaries as they're doing full-time work. During this pandemic, many of the wealthiest Americans actually capitalized on the hardships that people are going through and increased their wealth by billions while also refusing to increase workers' wages to a livable standard. Despite all the economic resources that exist in our nation, we have persisting economic disparities. Nearly 1/3 of all Americans live below or near the poverty line, and nearly 70% of Americans don't have $1,000 in savings to cushion them through hardship. With such small savings, many Americans are only one health or family emergency away from slipping into poverty. And wealth is not colorblind either. It has shades of color. Black people are 13% of the population, and yet only own 4% of the nation's household wealth.
Generations of policies, past and present, have created our current realities where we see massive racial disparities in wealth. And if you track wealth alongside place, you can see how the zip code you are born into often deeply shapes one's experiences, restricts life opportunities, and often predicts one's wealth. Many neighborhoods, both urban and rural, have been neglected and denied access to resources by the policies of our nation. For Black families, this was not only done out of neglect and omission, but intentional discrimination and commission. Redlining, restricted deeds on homes, sundown towns, racist government FHA policies, running highways through our neighborhoods, being denied homestead acts and GI bills, so much more, and that all together contributed to turning Black neighborhoods, often, many of them, into economic resource deserts. That's why we need to heed Dr. King's invitation and undergo a radical revolution of values and practice. And in the spirit of Dr. King, the work that he began has been revived again. He was working on the Poor People's Campaign in the last years of his life. He was encouraging solidarity and the linking of arms across racial differences. It was a movement for all poor people. It was demanding that every person had value and worth, and that we needed to eradicate poverty once and for all. Unfortunately, that war on poverty mutated into a war against poor people. Mass incarceration exploded, police spending exploded, harsh and demeaning rhetoric was targeted at people who had limited economic resources, and trickle-down economics that encouraged government welfare and exemptions for the very rich became the norming norm. We are still feeling the consequences for all the policy and political rhetoric that emerged, turning against the values Dr. King was inviting us to embrace. Fortunately, the Poor People's Campaign is reviving again, and under the leadership of Reverend William Barber and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris. They explain that their mission is to transform, quote, the interlocking evils of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and the war economy, and the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism, unquote. This is a movement inviting us to link arms in solidarity with vulnerable people across the nation and even in some ways across the globe. This new Poor People's Campaign reminds us of why a theology of shalom is so vital. And I say shalom because shalom, like envisioned by the prophet Isaiah, right, is more than what people mean often when they just say peace. Shalom is harmony, it's mutuality, it's flourishing. It is all of God's creation, interdependently thriving and living into the divine dream for all of us. It is a vision that reminds us that our lives are intricately interwoven and interlocked with one another. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are all interconnected and are all in this together. For Dr. King, he would usually evoke the language of beloved community, right, to capture this beautiful vision for humanity and all of creation. The opposite of the spirit of beloved community throughout our world is the spirit of nationalistic militarism. This was Dr. King's third and final evil that he believed we needed to confront. Of course, challenging American militarism isn't the most popular activity one can engage in. People interpret a prophetic critique of our government's actions as hatred for one's nation rather than a demonstration of care and concern for its direction. Christian nationalism in particular cultivates blasphemous and idolatrous positions that leave no room to interrogate morally bankrupt decisions by our nation's politicians and elite class. America has become a god for many, and the only proper service to such an idol is an unquestioning and unwavering allegiance in everything that it does. I'm glad that that's not how I love my children, right? My love, it's not conditional, but my love also challenges them to be the very best version of themselves that I can gesture them towards. If I saw my child harming someone else, I would intervene. I would not be applauding it. And so Dr. King refused to applaud the violence of our nation as well. In the last years of his life, he began to break silence, particularly around the global harm being done in Vietnam. He did so without any animosity towards those who worked as soldiers. He seemed to have a lot of empathy for them, and yet his challenge was to the government itself. And exactly 1 year before his death, on April 4th, 1967, Dr. King delivered his most radical and truthful talk entitled, "Beyond Vietnam." Despite criticism from some who wanted him to only talk about domestic civil rights, he was convinced that the poor of Vietnam were also his brothers and sisters. And he saw a direct connection between the issues he had confronted at home and this war being fought on the other side of the earth. He described how his fight against segregation in Montgomery led to a straight line to the current anti-war struggle that he was now embracing. It is well known that Dr. King is one of the most famous proponents of nonviolence in the struggle for social change. And in light of that, he began to realize his own hypocrisy concerning violence, because he had often spent time trying to convince oppressed people to adopt nonviolence as their strategy for social change, but yet had remained quiet in regards to the violence and militarism of his own nation. One of the many reasons he began to speak up was to break with the hypocrisy and silence on this issue. In his words, it came from his, this is a quote, experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I've told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I've tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they asked, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent, unquote. American militarism has unraveled out of control since Dr. King's days. We have military bases everywhere around the globe. We budget over $700 billion and are approaching $800 billion every year on our military-industrial complex and war machine. And it seems that the formation of mainstream American Christians leaves most of us incapable of separating our allegiance and discipleship to Jesus and religious nationalism. The end result is that many would rather blow our enemies to smithereens rather than love them. I remember when I was in college, I had a friend who one day, it was kind of a random conversation, but he came up to me and he said, "Drew, would you die for your country?" So I said, "Well, under what circumstances?" He said, no, that's not the question. The question is, would you die for your country? So again, I said, well, I need to understand, give me some context. What's going on? He said, no, that's not the question. The question is simple. It's flat out blank. Would you die for your country? And of course, at that point, then I was like, okay, I see what he's saying. Unwavering, under no conditions at all, would I die for my country? Of course, I'm like, heck no, of course not. I'm not giving a blank check. This is not God. I don't give my life away to my country in that kind of way. And I was quite baffled that as a follower of Jesus in particular, that there was this kind of unwavering allegiance, that no matter what, no matter if it was just or unjust, that I would give my life away to the nation. It's hard not to begin to see these triple evils as interlocking issues. One of the most significant overlaps is the interrelationship of Dr. King's prophetic witness against militarism with current conversations concerning the overfunded budgets and militarized police departments that contribute to racial brutality instead of investing in people and community flourishing. Dr. King said, quote, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death," unquote. In both cases, whether Dr. King's focus on military spending or our current focus on the overspending and militarizing of police with armor, tanks, SWAT teams, and the regular treatment of citizens as war combatants leads to the same conclusion. We should be investing in people in life-giving ways that get to the root of the issue and break the cycles of harm. So much so-called crime in poor communities is often related to poverty and instability, to drug addiction, lack of opportunities, and mental health crises. If we invested more in actual people than we did in social control through coercion and violence, we could begin to creep closer and closer to God's dream for us, where everyone is safe and where everyone has enough. But that requires that we value people's flourishing through preventative measures just as much, if not more, than the reactive social control methods that we employ. Racism, materialism, and militarism are all bound together. We must undergo a radical revolution. Our national and city budgets unveil our distorted values. People often talk about American exceptionalism, but I think American exceptionalism is often expressed in ways we shouldn't be proud of. Our military spending is actually exceptional. You know what else is? We have over 2 million people in prison, more than any other nation in the world, which is exceptional. We have more billionaires than any other nation and still have people living without housing or in poverty, making our wealth inequality exceptional. About 27.5 million people don't have health care, which is very exceptional compared to other wealthy nations. We could say similar things about our inadequate housing, inequitable education systems, or the use of the death penalty in this nation. It's not that we don't have the resources or the intelligence to change any of these things. We just haven't had the will or the desire. We value having the biggest military-industrial complex and base on every corner of the earth more than we care about our responsibility for vulnerable people, for those with limited economic resources and those who disproportionately suffer. Dr. King was right in 1967 when he said, quote, "I'm convinced that if we are to get onto the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values," unquote. If we are going to experience God's dream for us, we will have to work together in view of all the different dimensions and cycles of violence and oppression that are designed to destroy our lives. And I certainly believe that if, for those at least that consider themselves followers of Jesus, right, that we've got to realize that it's time to take Jesus seriously in our discipleship, right? In our everyday lives. The very same Jesus who in his very first sermon said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor," right? And what exactly did he do? He went out and he did just that, right? He cared for those who were disproportionately poor in his region. He aligned himself in solidarity with the Samaritans, or those vulnerable women. He identified in solidarity and in lockstep with the least, the last, and lost of his society. That was his example. That was God's reign broken into our world. This was his new society. This was the new thing that God was doing in the world. And we have an opportunity to join in with that. If we would somehow dare to break free from the kind of political captivity, right? The partisan captivity that has locked our imaginations and restricted our ethical practices in our world, where we think we have to think lockstep with political parties more than have a renewed imagination on the ground in the midst of our neighbors' actual lived experiences, the actual disproportionate suffering that's going on in our world, right? That we might actually learn how to love our neighbors concretely. That we could actually Amen, amen. That we might actually join in on the ground, organizing, active, locking in with our neighbors, seeking to transform our neighborhoods based on those who are disproportionately suffering in our communities. You know, Dr. King in 1963, Dr. King, he goes to Birmingham, Alabama. And while he's there, things don't quite go the way that they were planning for it to go. It was actually quite a frustrating experience for many of them. And in one particular moment, many of the leaders are in a hotel room. And in fact, I believe it was Dr. King's hotel room, kind of dialoguing together, trying to figure out what to do next because they had just been given an injunction against marching. And their funds were running out and people were not showing up the way that they expected. And they're not sure what to do, right? And on top of all of that, like Easter weekends and Passover were like coming up, right? And most of them were like pastors, right? And so they've got responsibilities. And so there they are, and they've got to figure out what they're going to do. And so they get into this room together and they're talking and they're all debating and thinking about all the different options that they have. And some of them are saying, look, let's send Dr. King out. Nobody can raise funds like Dr. King. Let's send him out and help him raise some funds, and we can then re-jump this movement altogether. Others are saying, look, man, I would love to do something, but I got to be with my church, right? This is the most important Sunday in the Christian calendar. I can't be down here getting in trouble with y'all, some good trouble, when I've got responsibilities with my church. Daddy King, I believe, was trying to convince King to come back. Stay out of it. You don't want to get arrested in Birmingham, AKA also known as Bombingham, where so many civil rights leaders were being attacked and bombed, and churches were being bombed, and certainly Fred Shuttlesworth experienced all kinds of dangers constantly living there in Birmingham, Alabama. There's this huge debate about what they should do. Everyone's got 10 people in a room, 11 different options for what they should be doing. The whole time that people are debating, King is not saying anything at all. King is just quiet. Not a word, just silent, just sitting there listening to everybody. They're going back and forth about what they should do. Then suddenly, King gets up. And you can imagine like either the hotel rooms where you got a living room and then like a separate bedroom with a door and they're kind of like in the living room space. King gets up and leaves and closes the door and goes into the bedroom and leaves everybody else out there. And I'm sure they're thinking like, what in the world? Our leader, he didn't even say anything. He didn't give no direction on what we should be doing. So they're sitting there. They may have probably still started arguing a little bit more. Minutes go by. Then suddenly the door swings open again. This time, when Dr. King comes out, something's different about King now. They look at him and they see Dr. King. Well, you think about like how you normally see Dr. King, right? Kind of black suit, white shirt, tie, right? Kind of clean cut look. He goes in that way, but he comes out and now he's wearing blue work shirt and blue jeans. Blue work shirt and blue jeans. The moment everybody sees him, everybody knows what that means, right? It's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work, right? This Passover, this Easter, we're not going to be worshiping Jesus in the fancy service this year. We're going to actually be living and embodying the story on the ground, participating in the suffering of Christ on behalf of our neighbors because we love them so much, right? And that's the famous scene, if you've seen that famous picture with Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth all together, all wearing blue work shirt and blue jeans. That's from that moment, right? And where he would later then write his famous letter from the Birmingham jail. So my invitation for us now, as we think about what it means to have a revolution of values, a revolution of values and practice, is an invitation for us to put on our blue jeans. Let's put on our blue jeans for justice. Let's put on our blue jeans for truth. Let's put on our blue jeans because we love our neighbors. Let's put on our blue jeans because we've got millions of folks locked up in prisons with their gifts not able to be flourishing and tapped into, right? Let's put on our blue jeans because we got so many schools that are underfunded and our children that are not able to live into all that God has created them to be. Let's put on our blue jeans because we've got undocumented neighbors worried about ICE, right? And if their family member is going to be deported. Let's put on our blue jeans and struggle together for this new beloved society, for justice, for love, for this new society that we can all commit ourselves to. Thank you.